Welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Andrew Ziegler.
And I'm your host, Ben Lloyd Pearson.
In today's news, we're talking about a few topics. Top of mind for me is Google's new AI search mode. Another one is a new buzzword I was reading about called AX, and not like an axe that you hit someone with, but actually agent experience. There was another one. AWS formed an internal agentic AI group. That was pretty cool. And I found some sweet, sweet, useless apps online. Ben, what do you want to talk about first?
As much as I love useless apps, I think we should dive into the Google search first. Let's hear about that.
Okay. So we've been talking about the search war between AI and Google on this podcast for a few weeks now. And the latest entry in the war is out. Google Search has unveiled a new AI mode that lets you ask complex questions with many different parts directly into the search bar. So before, what might have been 5 or 10 or maybe even many more individual queries by you as you try to understand a question or seek something out online. You can now explore these search results in a more natural conversation like way with Google.
Yeah, it seems that Google search lives to see another day, I guess. It's just really like kind of extraordinary to think about how much our typical research process has changed in such a short amount of time. Like the way we used to acquire information just feels like a distant dream at this point. But and I think this is also a great example of how like disruption from AI doesn't necessarily mean death. A lot of people are concerned about whose jobs are going to get taken or what sort of industries it's going to wipe out. And I think the reality is more like AI is going to disrupt us, but it's probably not going to wipe out like swaths of professional jobs overnight. Like there's a lot of room to just adapt and leverage all of the benefits that these tools are bringing us.
What I see here is Google taking another bite back from AI and the ongoing search wars, earning back a little bit of that market share. I think we've all had our mixed experiences going to Google and getting AI results or answers in response to your queries. And so, one step further towards a better version of that goal is really great. And like what you were saying, I think that there's more disruptions always on the horizon. They come from everywhere, but ultimately, what this disruption means is a higher demand for more unique experiences. Because now you can go to Google and ask that really in-depth, maybe even personal question and crawl across a lot of real-time resources in a way that maybe before you were using an LLM for anyways. It's going to create a more personalized experience for everyone online, which I think is going to just increase the demand for more jobs and more professionals and more technologists that come in and create these personalized experiences for people with the technology.
Yeah, and this ties nicely into the article that I wanted to bring up today, and that's this concept of agent experience. So, maybe this is disrupting DevX, or at least that's the point of this article that I read this week. And the whole point is that we have to start focusing on agent experience, which is defined as the holistic experience that AI agents have with as the user of a product or platform. So, think about like how everything is sort of built for humans as the end user, like the web, for example. Most websites are built for a human to visually analyze them and extract information from them. And if you're a bot that's just like scraping text off of a website, the web actually looks like entirely different to you. And in that same way, AI agents are the same. The patterns that work for humans aren't always going to work for these agents, at least not in an optimal way. And this article highlights two ways that agents are getting integrated into products. The first is verticals. That's like what we were talking about with the Google search example. And that's where you have tighter integrations of internal AI into your product. So, in addition to Google search, adding these new AI capabilities, it's like Google also adds like Gemini buttons to Google Docs, for example. And
Mhm.
then the other side of that is horizontal. So making it easier for external agents to interact with your platform. So think about like bring more select external models into a platform to leverage capabilities that it has.
Thinking about the agent experience for the first time is Very eye-opening. It kind of shows us the way that we're going to build technology to be consumed in the future, who are its future consumers. This kind of news also reminds me of the recent, model context protocol, and all of the development around that. And if you're not familiar, I talked with a guest this week about MCP. And he told me all about how companies are turning their products and tools for LLMs into things they can use. I'm excited to bring him on the podcast in the future, but it really got me
Awesome.
thinking about this entire experience, because this is exactly what he described: creating the schema, the tooling for you to plug it into Cursor, for you to plug it into your at-home chatbots, for you to put it into any kind of in product or personalized experience. And so um, the idea that they have an experience too, and there's things that they need, it kind of it flips the entire script on how we might build our actual workflows to be used. And ultimately, I think it's time to think maybe a little bit about that agent experience alongside your developer one, when you're creating resources or otherwise developing your technology. Think about who might be using it.
Yeah. So what's the next story you want to talk about, Andrew?
Well, we got to talk about the useless apps at this point, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
We've been talking about a lot of AI stuff. This one's a little more fun. Um, you know, have you ever kind of wished that your phone kind of just like wouldn't let you use it at all? Maybe like at all. Do you ever pick it up and you're just like, I wish I wasn't picking it up as much?
Yeah, at least twice a week. At least twice a week.
At least twice a week, right? And there's all sorts of ways you can fix that. Now you can put privacy locks on your phone, you can put time locks on your phone. Here's a really fun one. Someone built an app that doesn't let you open any kind of media app on your phone unless you literally verify that you've gone outside and touched grass. So you have
Mm,
to open the app and then walk outside and find a patch of grass and reach out with your camera facing your hand and touch the grass. You can't actually use anything until you go outside. I love this. I mean, everyone online, we always say, when someone goes over the line or they just need to put down the keyboard, that's what we tell them to do, right? Go touch some grass, like get some perspective, cool
yeah.
off for a second. So someone built an app to do it.
Yeah, if you've been on Reddit any length of time, somebody has probably told you to go touch grass at one point.
I love useless apps. This one though, for me, it's like I immediately thought like, oh, how could I break this? Could I use this app and then like could I print out a picture of grass? And oh, it's probably a little more sophisticated than that. But like I actually have a bonsai tree. What if I like faked some perspective, right? And it thought I was outside. So that was immediately where my mind went with it. But this
Yeah, well,
was a
you're illustrating the for it to work for me, it would have to be go touch snow, like,
oh,
because right now
very
my
true.
grass is under a foot of snow.
I didn't even think of that. What if you're somewhere where there is no grass? I think maybe
Yeah,
there maybe needs to be regional variants of this app.
yeah, but, this is, I think, such an emblematic, representation of how AI is gonna change software development, right? Like, let's set aside, all these engineering teams who build these robust platforms and need complex orchestration of AI agents to for a moment, just think about the everyday person who doesn't know how to do all of that stuff. And, one of the common refrains about generative AI is like, it's pretty good at building like hobby apps, prototypes, proof of concepts, etc. So, whether I wanted to like create a version of this that works for me, where I can go outside and touch snow, uh, or if it's somebody who's never built software before but has a great idea for a simple app, it's empowering like all different types of people to create new things that they weren't capable of doing just a couple of years ago.
I completely agree. We're heading for a time where anyone can spin up very personalized software on a whim that can serve a very specialized or personal niche for them. Maybe it doesn't have to work well, doesn't have to scale literally at all. We're talking about one user, maybe even for a temporary amount of time. And I think we're going to see a proliferation of these almost disposable like apps and technologies that pop up just to explore an idea or to build it on something, or in this case, maybe even to make a bit of art, because I think that AI will ultimately lower the barrier for people that are not in technology to build and create things. We saw the same exact thing happen with video games, which was a very highly technical field, that then slowly became democratized by tooling, to become more accessible to artists. And now you see video games as an artistic medium. I think you're going to see the same thing happen with software and with applications. Because when you unleash it on a world of people who don't think like technologists, they're going to build things in totally different ways. And we're not even ready for it yet.
Yeah, I think there's a bold prediction you're hiding there that maybe you should own. Like, will AI normalize software as art? I think Andrew
Oh,
Ziegler says yes.
I absolutely think so. I'm excited to see what kind of things come out of the future.
Yeah, well, I love how every topic that we talk about, even if it's not about AI, always comes back to AI. So, I think we've got one more AI story, Andrew. So, why don't you cue that one up for us?
Oh, okay, great. One more AI boomerang for you. So, this one is, Amazon, AWS, everyone knows it. They formed a group internally that's focused on agentic AI. This is yet another large company we've been talking about on the podcast, taking yet another very big move to form their internal teams to put together their greatest minds to focus on how AI can transform them internally. And it goes back to Conway's Law, even a basic principle in software development that you ship your teams, right? Your software products reflect your team structure. And so if AI is important to you and it needs to be everywhere and it needs to be parts of your product, then it's important that you put together a task force, put together a head, put resources behind a diverse group of representations of users in your company to figure out how to make this work and to get it in place. And we saw this with Goldman Sachs. We saw this with Microsoft. So here
Yeah.
is yet another one from AWS.
Yeah. Humans managing AI agents will eat the world. We've heard software ate the world. We've heard open source ate software. I think humans managing AI agents really is going to be the future of this all. And I actually want to make just a completely shameless plug for the Engineering Intelligence newsletter over on LinkedIn. This is a new newsletter from LinearB that I've been contributing to, and in last week's edition, we shared a whole bunch of practical advice for how you can start adopting agentic AI into your software delivery lifecycle. So we have all these giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, everyone out there is adopting agentic AI. And there's no reason that everyone that's listening to this right now shouldn't also be doing that. So I'm definitely going to recommend everyone go follow LinearB on LinkedIn, subscribe to the Engineering Intelligence newsletter. A ton of great news happening over there. Yeah. So, Andrew, tell us, who do we have on the show this week?
Oh, I'm really excited for this guest. So after the break, we're bringing David Mytton onto the pod. He's the CEO of ArcJet, a security SDK for developers, and he's the founder of Console.dev, which is a weekly newsletter where he focuses on a curated selection of interesting developer tools. David has a really discerning eye for what's good and what's not, what you should use and what you should try. He tries everything so you don't have to, and his experiences go really far. He has a finger right on what makes for a delightful developer experience, and I'm really excited to share our conversation with y'all. So stick around for the discussion where we talk about the realities of shift left in security and the status quo of DevSecOps. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by David Mytton, CEO at ArcJet and the founder of the Console.dev weekly newsletter. David, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.
You're a seasoned developer and founder and an angel investor as well. And we brought you on the show to chat about your approach to shift left within DevSecOps, which is something that you describe as largely buzzwords that haven't achieved their intended impact. And I really want to start there. So perhaps you can set the stage for us about why the shift left approach is applied to DevSecOps and what are some of the issues with it.
It's really modeled off the very successful DevOps philosophy. And this takes us quite a long way back in history to when development was entirely about just writing code and then you would hand it over to somebody else to deal with. In the very old days, that was physically shipping it. And so ops wasn't really a thing. But as services became more popular and we needed to access things that were constantly updated, then it became, well, how do we run the software that we write? And traditionally, you would have sysadmins, and then later on, that broadened out into different types of operations. But essentially, it was a separate team that would deal with deploying and updating and making sure the infrastructure, the servers and the network was all running smoothly. As we move to more of a cloud environment, then the physical side of it kind of disappeared. Obviously, it's still there, but for most people, using the cloud abstracts the compute, the storage, the data center, those kind of things. And so as more software became involved in the operation side of things, like software-defined networking, the actual virtualization of the system, it became a question of how do we run this entire environment? And separating code that really, if you write code, what's the point if it's never run? And whose responsibility is that? And then when something breaks, who should fix it? Operations teams didn't write the code, so why should they fix it? Or even could they fix it because they don't know what's going on? And so this idea of DevOps just meant that developers took more responsibility for running the code that they wrote. And that became testing it, setting up CI/CD as you got closer to production, deploying it, and then when it's actually running, dealing with monitoring and any instance that happened. And that was pretty successful because it's quite easy for developers to understand, well, why do they need to run their software? It's because why are they writing it in the first place? It's to deliver a service or to provide something to users. And so it brings them a lot closer to that. And you can replicate the production environment very closely on your laptop or in a staging environment. And so it's a lot easier to understand how to actually set it up and test it and make sure it's all working. And so DevOps kind of merged into DevSecOps with this idea of, well, if we're getting developers to run the code that they write and take responsibility for it, then why can't they also do the same thing with security and take what the security team had typically done and let developers take responsibility for it? That was kind of the idea. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. And so based upon the story you've told, it's really a growing amount of abstraction and complexity away from being maybe a more physical-based computing solution into something that's abstracted in the cloud. And each step on that process, the developers get closer and closer to where things are released and things are secured and tested. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, that's right. It's giving developers more responsibility so that they can understand everything that goes into actually running the code that they write. And so this then led into the specialism of site reliability engineering, which was popularized by Google and a few the larger tech companies. Because if developers are running their software, what else is there to do? Well, there's quite a lot to do, and there's a lot of specialist knowledge involved with, certainly with large-scale systems, making sure they're reliable and that when developers are building, they don't have to understand the full details and can build on top of a platform. That's kind of what you're doing with the cloud, where you're building on top of Amazon or Google or Microsoft's platform. They abstract out all the data center, and as a user, you just have to think about the particular primitive that you're using, the compute or the database or whatever service it is. But underlying that, there's still a lot of operations work. It's just you're paying someone else to do it. And so the idea with DevOps and SRE was that developers can do a lot of things, but there are still things that are probably not good use of their time, or there are specialists that can help build out a platform for larger teams. And so SRE became this specialism where they would operate the internals and the underlying systems. And then they would give tools to the developers to allow them to autonomously deploy onto those systems. And again, that's worked really well. SRE come in and maybe advise on the design of a system, and then the developers will use the platform and the tools that they've created. And ideally, SRE are not involved in particular projects, but they are responsible for the whole system, the system as a whole. And the idea with DevSecOps is basically the same thing. Developers should take more responsibility for the security of their software. And then when there's a problem, inevitably they're going to have to fix it. But perhaps you could have a specialist security team who would give them tools to make that security job a lot easier. Unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out that way.
And why hasn't it worked out that way in execution?
I think it's down to the incentives. So for a software developer, their job is to build things, either because they're building an internal system and they have internal customers who need something, or they're externally providing a service to users. And so you've actually customers paying you to build things. So that's the developer's job. Build something new, fix bugs, and deliver value to customers, essentially just building. The incentives for security people are very different. They are either there to break something because they're doing pen testing or looking for vulnerabilities, or they're there to mitigate risk, which generally means stopping things from happening. And that is basically the opposite of what developers are responsible for. So even before we get into any of the details of specific things that might have failed with DevSecOps, the incentives just don't align between the security team and the development team. And they have to work together in many cases, which can be a challenge. There's often a lot of friction there, but this fundamental mismatch in incentives is the big problem because everything comes down to incentives, really.
Right. So the devs are there to build stuff and to make things, and security there, and sometimes in the dev's mind is there to stop things or to halt or slow things down. And then the security
Right.
team only wants things that are secure, obviously, to go through. So you end up in this state of tension where both of their incentives of what they want out of the engineering process are different. And is that because of how DevSecOps has shifted the responsibilities more into developers, or is that a response to that tension that is felt between security and dev professionals?
That was a response because ultimately all vulnerabilities come down to some error or problem in the software that someone has written, or the processes around it. And so you always have to involve developers in the security process. There's no getting away from that. But because the incentives were so different, like developers are incentivized to build things, they're on deadlines, they've got to deliver customer value. And security is often a distraction from that. Now, it's a distraction for very good reasons. It is counter to that incentive or the real goals of developers. And I think that's why it's become such a challenge to encourage developers to think about security from the beginning. Because right, if you're in a startup, what's the point of securing something if you have no users? And as your company gets larger, you really only think about security either when you're required to from a regulation perspective or when your customers start asking you for details about your system. And that's when the incentives start to align again because there's a customer asking you for something, so you should implement it. Otherwise, it's really down to the developer to put the best efforts in or to do things because they think it's the right thing to do. And we know from human behavior that probably people try and do that, but maybe you don't do that all the time.
Exactly. And so if this state of tension is just innate to those roles, what can developers do, and security professionals as well, to bridge that gap and maybe foster that more security conscious culture that allows them to exist in more harmony?
I think this is the real challenge, and it's developers are not thinking about security problems, and this has given them the reputation of not caring about security. And I think that's actually it's the outcome. It's what happens as a result of that thinking, but it's not a deliberate thing. In most cases, it's just, some cases it's a lack of knowledge, but that's not an excuse really. Companies run education programs and training and it's all really boring. And so that's one of the challenges. But it's really about developers are trying to solve a problem. They're not thinking about security because security generally doesn't help them solve that problem. And so this means that they might be dealing with API abuse or sign-up form spam or fraudulent credit card transactions. And those are problems that the developer thinks about. Now, from a security mindset, the solution might be, well, we'll buy a bot detection product, or we'll build rate limiting, or use one of the credit card fraud services. And those are security solutions. But the developer's thinking in a completely different mindset. They're not thinking in terms of a security product they should buy or a particular acronym that they need to understand and implement in their system. They're thinking, loads of people are using my API and it's costing me loads of money, or we're getting loads of signups and they're all spam and they're not helping our service, or we're hurting our reputation with our credit card processor because we're getting loads of chargebacks. Those are the problems that the developer's trying to solve, and security needs to provide the security team. The security industry needs to provide solutions to developer problems, not try and sell them another product.
Right. So this brings us back to the core of our topic of shifting left and applying that to DevSecOps. And And some of what you're touching on now is, I think, really salient here about part of that is putting the right kind of security tools into developers' hands earlier in the process. It makes it more part of their development journey as they're creating the actual software. And it allows them to have earlier conversations with security about what they're building as well. And so what are some emerging trends or tools from your perspective that maybe are delivering on this or making steps to bringing this more into harmony?
The buzzword right now is secure by design, and this has been pushed in particular by governments. US government has a lot of effort going behind that, and the EU has recently passed some laws around defaults. Secure by design is a great idea, and the challenge is the actual implementation. What does it mean? On the consumer side of things, it means things like when you buy a new Wi-Fi router, it doesn't have a default password, and it can be updated for the next 5 to 10 years. So when there are vulnerabilities discovered, they can be updated automatically. That's quite easy to build in security by design, or at least you know how to do it. You can put it on a checklist. It's a lot more challenging to do that with the underlying software engineering approach. And how do we encourage developers to build security into their products when the incentive isn't there? Well, one answer is just change incentives by regulating and force developers to think about this. And there's a question around liability and how the industry works when there's a big vulnerability found. Whose responsibility is it? Is there a monetary value attached to that? That can be a good way to change behavior. But as soon as you get regulation involved, then it becomes, well, who's got the most money to do the lobbying? How do you balance the different requirements? And then regulation increases barriers to entry, which has been the great thing about software. Like, you literally need no qualifications. You can just write code and you can put something online and people can start using it, which is great for innovation, perhaps not so good for safety and security. So I think that's the big challenge around security by design in terms of how you actually implement it and enforce it. And ideally, we don't have the government forcing people to do things. Maybe that's where it ends up if it doesn't change. But I think the fundamental is around behavior and how developers think about this. And it's very difficult to change human behavior. And so you have to change the underlying system, right? So that developers, people, whatever the system is that you're thinking about, the user of that system, whoever's involved in that system, gets the benefit for free. So they don't have to think about it. So by using that particular system, then they automatically get the benefits because the operator of the system or the designer of that system has made that change on your behalf. And I think that is the responsibility then of the developers of infrastructure and the tooling to encourage developers to do this or to use these systems that give them security by default.
So if there exists a class of tools that allow developers to implement security practices earlier in their process, I'm curious from your perspective, because you have so much experience reviewing hundreds of tools for your newsletter, Console.dev, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a moment. And when you approach this idea to evaluating these tools or thinking about how can we put better tools in developers' hands earlier in the process, what are some of the things that you look for as someone who's looked at a lot of tools and it has become very discerning for what we put in developers' hands?
Yeah, so for Console.dev, I've reviewed probably 300 or so every year for the last four or 5 years now. So I've played a lot with a lot of tools. We put into 2 or 3 every week. So those are just the ones that actually get through. And the first thing I think about is, well, would I use this? And having been in the industry for almost 20 years, I kind of have it's my opinion on this. But then there are some specific things. So the most common problem that I see with a dev tool is the documentation has some flaws. Often the quick start guide is fine and it works. Sometimes it doesn't, and then that's essentially it's off the list straight away, because if the quick start doesn't work, then no one's going to be able to use it. But the common failure scenario is you do the quick start, the tool does what is advertised, it's got a load of other features, but you have no idea how to use them because none of them are documented. That's a real problem. Developers don't necessarily like writing documentation. I spend a lot of time at ArcJet writing documentation for our product, for our security product, just because I know that is like whenever I'm trying a new dev tool, the first thing I'll do is go to the docs. And so that needs to be part of the product. We consider the docs part of the product. And then the other failure scenario is once you've done that quick start and it's working, how easy is it to adapt the product to the complexities of whatever it is you're building? This is a failure of breaking out of the happy path and a lack of flexibility in the design of the product, or a lack of documentation explaining how to use all of the options and the configurations. Because most of it, like you see all these templates for like a chat app or how to implement authentication, really straightforward. Those are important things, and building a chat app is really fun, but that's not what most apps are. And you've got like all sorts of different requirements that customers are asking for, and you're building all for these different variants. And that's often where dev tools break, is because they don't work in these various scenarios.
That makes sense. You're touching on something that is very, very close to my heart, especially when you talk about documentation and evaluating new tools. As a developer advocate, I completely understand the mindset of when you go to a new tool and you're trying it out for the first time. There's a few gut checks that you do. You go to the repo and you see when was the last commit. You go to the documentation and you look at the quick start guide, and is it a chat app? And if it is, does it work when you read it from top to bottom? So those types of approaches are, I think it's very delightful to find that they're universal when other people evaluate software as well. And so when you go down this path of evaluating software, and you look at the docs, and it's about putting great examples in developers' hands so they can envision the tool. And it's about the tool also being flexible for what they're looking to implement. Do you see these tools oftentimes as starting grounds, or do you see them as holistic solutions? Like, are they there to inspire or maybe guide a path for the developer to start with this tool and then maybe kind of build it into something else? Or do you see it as like a one-stop shop? Developers need to be looking for like that Swiss Army knife.
This is often the distinction between a really great open source tool that someone's built and has become popular and a product from a company. And the open source tools, typically they solve a problem. The good ones, they solve a particular problem really, really well. And they might have some side features here and there, but they're very focused on the specific thing. And that's great for low-level infrastructure, dev tools, terminal interfaces, those kind of things. You don't necessarily want that to become a huge, massive monolithic project with all sorts of different features here and there. And there is this concept of software being done. And I think very few developers think about products like that. Certainly startups and businesses, they can't think about that, I suppose, because they're always having to add the next thing for growth. But certainly for open source tools, you should consider, well, is this done? And there are very few that I see that take that approach. But the ones that do, to your point about, well, when was it last updated? Perhaps they haven't made any major changes to the code recently, other than like putting in dependency updates and just making sure it continues to work on the platforms that support it. When I see a tool like that, then that is very interesting because it's well maintained, it's within the scope of the original idea, it's basically done, and it's just in maintenance mode. And I think that's really rare these days to find software that just like, yeah, it's done, and we'll maintain it, fix a few bugs, keep dependencies up to date, but it is what it is.
That's absolutely right. I think done software, finished products is very mythical. You don't really see those that often. And when you do, you wonder if that is really what they are. Are they really done? And so this really brings me to my next topic of Console.dev just in general. I'd love to learn a little more about how this newsletter came to be. I myself have checked out Console.dev. You make great tool recommendations. What I personally love about the newsletter, and I'm sure our readers and listeners will as well, is that it's very straightforward, but opinionated in a way where I'm like, I could get behind this tool, yes or no. I can go through the list and understand if it's going to work for me. So I'm kind of curious, how did you cultivate that voice, and what inspired you to go down this road of sharing developer tools more broadly?
Well, it's really just my opinion on things condensed into 300 characters of what I like, 300 characters of what I don't like. And that is the unique bit that I still haven't seen anywhere else, really. It's only not in a newsletter format. There's lots of really great newsletters, and often they're just loads of links, and they're just the interesting things that happened in the period that the newsletter is sent, and that's great. It's a good format, but it's kind of passive reading. You might not read it every week. You probably might not discover anything interesting every week, and it's just general interest. And when I was thinking, before I started Console, I just wanted to know, well, how do I stay up to date with all the things that are happening in tech, in software, in the cloud and services, open source. And whilst you find those things on Reddit and Hacker News and Twitter and Blue Sky and all the various social networks, there was nowhere that was focused purely on developer tools and only on developer tools. Like, you can find those tools elsewhere. And then there was no recommendation. Like, you might see someone tweet something, and then next thing they'll be tweeting something else or a photo, and there's no this consistent discovery engine. And so I thought, well, I could do that because I like playing with dev tools. I really love technology. And I have an opinion on what works and where because I've run services at scale. I built software in different languages. I don't know every language and every tech stack, but I can probably assess something in a way that another experienced developer would do. And the goal with the newsletter is to give you something at least once a month that you actually think, yes, this is great. I could use this personally or at work. Maybe you find more tools, but at least once a month is the goal. And so I subscribe to several thousand blogs. I've got a feed reader, I've got filters, I've got automated scripts that just highlight all the new beta and alpha releases of tools. And then the reviews of tools it's just things I come across, and it might be a brand new thing that was just released, or it could be something that's been out for 10 years and I've just discovered it, or I've been using it recently, or there's been a new version that I want to have a look at. So it's all sorts of different things, and there's no particular theme other than dev tools that are good.
And I'm curious too, when you have reception from folks who read your newsletter and they say, "Oh, I loved this," or "I didn't like that." What are some of the things that, or challenges or pain points even that you think developers look for very often in your content that for your tools to solve for them?
So the key thing with the why I don't like section is it's less about this sucks about the tool. It's more these are the things or the limitations of the tool that you're going to discover if you try it out in 5 or 10 minutes. You'll discover these things. And because I only include things I think are actually worth your time, I don't feature tools I think are bad, but there's nothing that is 100% good. And so it's really looking at, well, what do developers use on a regular basis? They're on their laptop, their system, so terminal, utilities, IDE, integrations, things that help them write software. And then there's cloud utilities, products as well. There can be commercial products, things you have to pay for, but things that are going to help developers with their job. It might be a paid editor. It might be a cloud service that is part of their core infrastructure. It's really anything that a developer might want to use. So the most popular things that show up are editors. I think whilst everyone probably uses VS Code, there's been an explosion recently of lots of really interesting new editors, whether it's kind of VS Code forks that have added loads of cool AI stuff, or it's brand new editors like Zed, which is implemented in Rust from scratch. There's like Mac specific ones like Nova, there's Vim, of course, and all the different plugins that you might have. So there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening just on the editor side of things, and that tends to be the most popular category.
Oh, completely. I think the developers get very specific about things that have dot files and they can configure in that kind of way, especially when you get really close to the IDE. And you're touching on something that I've noticed in the last year or 2 years is that you're getting these tool categories that have typically been kind of, quote unquote, solved for in many ways, suddenly getting disrupted, obviously by AI and transformation in general within the tech industry. And I'm curious, what are some of the maybe biggest pitfalls that you see new innovative products like fall into when they try to reinvent a category or reapproach something that developers in their minds think has solved?
The most interesting one, I think, is probably the terminal. I thought the terminal has been solved. That is done. You're using iTerm, or you're using the one that's built into macOS. Windows obviously has one as well, and Linux has a couple, Alacrity and Kitty and a few others like that. But I essentially thought, this is solved. It's open source. There's never a business here. And we've seen some interesting startups appear, which I still have some skepticism about the business model around selling a terminal. But I think there is a lot of work happening there. I think AI makes terminals particularly more interesting, but it's because of having to remember all the commands. You're going to remember a lot of them, but very few people actually read the manual and don't know the man command, and it's sometimes not even that helpful. So I think that's where AI can make a lot of difference. But people have a lot of opinions on their terminal editor and the terminal emulator that they're using. And I think it's a very tricky sector to get into, almost as difficult as code editors, because but in my experience, developers don't pay for anything ever except for their editor. But their company may buy things for them. And that's where the additional tools come in. But as far as the developer individual paying for stuff, it's very, very unusual, apart from the editor itself. So I think there's an opportunity there, and we've seen a few startups in adding and innovating on that as well.
And when you touched on something very funny to me, which is, developers don't like to pay for products, and maybe this is something that it gets to the root of the differences between their incentives with the business and with security even as well. Because developers, they just want to build, they want to make, and they want to create, and their tools that they use, they need to delight them. They need to have the ability to do the things that they need to. They're less interested in like, oh, what's the pricing model? What's the subscription tiers? What are the things that I need for the enterprise level in order to deliver X, Y, Z? So do you find that when developer tools are evaluated, it's almost like they're evaluated in two different ways? You have the business evaluating it for the business needs. You have the developers evaluating it for the developer needs. How often are those in conflict too? Just like how developers and security are.
This has been an ongoing challenge, I think, linked to the sustainability of open source and how very popular and important projects have historically been developed by one or two people and not full time, and there's been huge burden on them. And then when you charge developers for things, like you go on Reddit and people are complaining a lot about, well, I don't want to pay $10 a month for this critical service that I'm using in my side project. Or they're they write up about how they saved $100 a month by spending 4 weeks building a custom system. And so there's this real disconnect between the value that developers get and the value that they think they're getting, and how they attach a dollar amount to that. And I think that's where, when you're building a DevTools company, the developer might be the user, but the developer is very rarely the buyer, and it's very difficult to sell the value to an individual developer. This has become a thing. It's only in the last 5 or 10 years as DevTools startups have become a real thing, because developers have a lot of influence, and that's how you can really sell into organizations, is when developers love a product. Then they're going to recommend it. They may not buy it themselves, but they will recommend it, and then they can get access to the budget or convince the budget holder. But it's a real tension, because people don't like it when services shut down or when they get acquired, and when they're shut down as a result of that. And often it's because they couldn't figure out the sustainable business model behind whatever it is that they're building.
If the developer is the champion and not the buyer for the software, or they're the advocate for its usage, what are some key principles or best practices that you would give to like a dev toolings company or new kind of tool that's trying to strike a balance between appealing to that champion and appealing to that buyer?
I think you have to take it in stages. So you have to work for the user first, because if you don't have the user, then you either go out of business, or you have to take the approach of forcing people to use things. And we've all been forced to use horrible systems, probably some kind of expense management system that we hate. And that's because the user isn't the buyer. The buyer is some other department within the company that deals with a completely different part of the product. And so the user experience is terrible. And so that's where we're doing what I think is an unusual approach with security, is because most security products target security people, and we'll have to go there at some point. We'll have to build features for security people, but most security products are not built for developers, and that's what we're trying to do with ArcJet. And then later we'll go to the security organization and the infrastructure team and the CTO and show them the value that we're adding, and hopefully it'll be obvious, but the developer is going to be adopting the product. The big challenge is that you can't just put an ad in front of a developer and expect them to sign up as a result of it. That does happen, but normally they will have seen the product many times before in different forms. They might have seen a YouTube video, they might have heard someone talk about it on a podcast, then they read a comment somewhere. And then when they see an ad or maybe a blog post or something completely different, they click through, and that's when they take the action. And this makes marketing to developers very, very difficult because they are very, very astute and they know when they're being marketed to. But it's also very expensive because you have to cover every single channel and you don't know which ones are working. And I think this is what has made the rise of influencers, particularly on YouTube, become an interesting phenomenon over the last few years, because it is social proof from someone that you trust. And although it is still marketing and there are sponsors and they take money for different things, and they're usually very upfront about that, it is expensive, and developers are probably one of the hardest groups to sell to.
Absolutely. Developers are very astute. I say, as someone myself who's evaluated many dev tools and use every trick possible to escape around those lead gen forms or to otherwise get my hands on what I'm looking for. Or if I'm evaluating, doing so almost like I'm behind enemy lines, I'm incognito. I don't want them to know I'm here looking at it. I don't want the emails. I don't want the blog posts. I don't want my LinkedIn feed to change, right? So, and so that's kind of an interesting dynamic, of course, when developers do go in and evaluate their tools, which goes back to what you mentioned earlier about being a really strong thing you must do of having a great documentation, because that is where they go to find out those things when they don't want to be marketed to. They want to go read the documentation, which can be, of course, its own form of marketing, just like how the influencers on YouTube can be. But the difference here is that you're allowing the developers to evaluate and draw their own conclusions. And I think that that's really the heart of what helps developers evaluate the best tools, is when they're evaluating it for themselves on their own standards and basis, not on someone else's rubric. Do you agree?
That's exactly right. And what you just described is how not to do developer marketing, like force them through a form or just speak to someone. You look at any of the good dev tools, any product that developers are involved, and you can go on the website, and firstly, you'll go and scan the docs, and the docs should give you a very good sense of how to set it up and the value that you're going to get very quickly. And then you should just be able to try the product. You have to be able to sign up, install it, run it locally probably, or in whichever environment it's going to be, and actually test it out. And 99% of the time, you're going to log in with GitHub, probably, maybe Google, but certainly GitHub, and you're going to get a Gmail account. And sometimes they bounce, but most of the time they work. But developers don't reply to emails most of the time. And they don't, like you said, you're putting a lot of effort sometimes to get around those things to make sure that you don't get emails. And so that's how companies should do it. They should make it really easy, like a one-click sign in with GitHub. Don't send any emails, except maybe one with a link to the docs and some interesting resources, and then let developers test it out. And you can instrument your product, so you can see when people have signed up, when they've activated, when they're actually starting to get value. And there are different points when you might want to reach out and say, like, if there's a long gap between sign up and nothing's happened, maybe you might want to say, did you have a problem? Did it not meet your requirements? But more likely, it's once they've installed it and you know that they have seen some value, that's the point to send a message and just say, how did you get on? Did you check this doc? This really helps. And particularly if you know where those users are coming from, like for ArcJet, we integrate into Netlify, Fly.io, Vercel. And when we know you've come through their marketplace, we'll send you a couple of links just to how to connect it up or to set it up in a certain way. And you can start making these little tweaks and adjustments just to help the developer figure it out, because they're going to figure it out themselves. And if they don't, then most likely they're going to open a GitHub issue or come on Discord, or they're just going to disappear. So just making all these channels available, you don't need to force developers, you don't need to trick them, and just remove all the friction. And that's where I see a lot of success.
Just focus on building something great that delights them and solves their problem, and they'll do the marketing for you.
Well, that's 50% of it, building the product. I think the other 50% is the awareness. And
Absolutely.
Once they're into the product, then you make it really easy, and they'll do the evaluation. so long as they have the right docs and the resources to do it. The tricky bit is just the awareness, just because there are so many tools. There are so many products trying to reach developers, so many open source things. There's open source variants of startups and commercial products, and just getting the mind share of the developer is very, very difficult.
You've mentioned at a few points your company ArcJet and how it's solving some of these problems with developer tools. I'm curious, could you tell us more about ArcJet and how it came to be and what it's solving for its developer users?
ArcJet is a security as code product that helps developers implement security features like bot protection, personal information detection, attack protection, and it's implemented as an SDK. So rather than throwing a firewall or a network CDN or something like that in front of your application right at the end of the process that can't be tested, and your application has no idea of which requests were blocked or why allowed requests were allowed through, ArcJet is installed into your dependencies and you integrate it into your application so that you can build in security rules with the context, knowing who should be accessing which rights and what kind of things you're expecting versus what you're not. And so it allows developers to take control of some of the security functionality that they're going to have to build at some point anyway. And we can help you build it with just a couple of lines of code. And then as it gets more sophisticated, you can break out of those, the quick start guide that we talked about, and really integrate it directly into your application. And you can test it on your laptop. And this is often a challenge with security products, is they're deployed only in production, and trying to test them, often it's another team that deploys it. It breaks stuff, and then you get a ticket about the thing that they need to deploy, but they don't understand anything about how you've designed the product and written the code. And so you then back to this fight between different teams of implementing the security rules. And our philosophy is that developers should be able to do all of that in the code where they're used to working. And that's why we built it as an SDK.
And when developers utilize this tool to bring security practices into their building earlier in the process and allow them to do also part of that testing and evaluating themselves, how does that address that conflict between those two groups that we talked about earlier? What have you seen?
So this is about solving a particular problem, and that's why we have what we call the primitives, the bot protection, rate limiting, personal information detection. There's a few different primitives that we have that you can compose to build up a security feature. But typically, it's a developer is thinking about a specific problem. So if we take one of the ones that we talked about earlier, sign up form spam, the way you solve that is through setting up a rate limit. So you probably got to deploy Redis somewhere, and then figure out how to scale that if you go to different regions. Then you've got to set up bot detection, and that's probably buying a different service and integrating it into your form. And then you've got to figure out what email validation and verification. Like, is this a valid email string? That's not that difficult to do. But then, is the email deliverable? Does it have valid MX records? Is it a disposable email address? And then figuring out, well, is the user coming through a VPN? Maybe that's fine. What if they're coming through Tor? Maybe that's not so good. What if they're from a different country that you're not interested in selling to? This is where it starts becoming a real pain for developers. And so ArcJet solves that specific thing. We have a sign-up form protection product that integrates rate limiting, bot protection, email verification, and it solves that within a couple of lines of code. And it's integrated into your framework, whichever you're using, and sits in code so you can actually test it locally. So the idea is that your product manager or your CEO or CTO comes to you and you're dealing with sign-up form spam, you can just implement the solution in probably half an hour, test it locally and deploy it to production, and not have to involve the security team at all, if there is even a security team there.
And how did you build your champions? Going back to what we talked about earlier of, having good documentation and making resources available. How exactly did you go out charting that course and making ArcJet like a great tool for the developers to experience?
There's the API design. So you include the SDK as like any other library, and you get access to the API. And the API means, like, how do you interact with it when you're writing code? Does it show you the correct hints? When you hover over things in your editor, does it have a useful documentation? All these little things like the doc comments that you put in, spending time on those. So those little details all the way through to how the types are defined, so that if you configure a rule incorrectly, your editor will warn you, assuming you're using TypeScript, hopefully, and then your editor will warn you. all the way through to the sign up flow and actually using it. Like we had a team offsite last month, and the first day was sign up to the product multiple times from different email accounts and log and then fix all of the little annoyances that you find. And when you're just testing it, you think, oh, this is great and there's no problems. But then you think, oh, someone's gone through an OAuth flow and they've cancelled. What happens then? Or they come back and they don't remember which way they logged into the product. Or they change their email address halfway through and they want to go back and sign in with a different provider. It's like all these edge cases that are a massive hassle that you don't necessarily think of the first time around. And so it's just a lot of time and effort going into all of those and testing it.
From what you've described today in our conversation, it really sounds like that's the answer to addressing, a shift left culture within engineering and bringing DevSecOps closer to the engineer. It's about taking those security tools and practices and putting them in a format, wrapping them up in a package and a bow in the way that developers are expecting and that they want to use, and that ultimately delights them to integrate. And that helps them build that empathy and understanding for the security process as well, and makes them work better with the security team. And maybe my last question on this is on the security teams that are within a product that apply and adopt and use this with their developers. What are some of the things that they say or that their reactions are to using like a security-based SDK with their engineers?
It's unusual. I think developers are not used to interfacing with security products. And when they are, it's some kind of ClickOps web UI that they have to click around, figure out the options, and then things change instantly in production. And you're very scared that you have just broken everything for all your users. And so it's an interesting, when we see people install the SDK and see their editor providing them with hints of what they should set up. And like something like rate limiting, it's not that difficult to build. And so we can show that as a real example because developers get it. They understand they could think through probably how to build it. When you start showing them, okay, well, now you've got rate limiting, you can add bot protection, just add this line and run this command and you can see it working. That's a lot harder to build. And then personal information detection, where we can redact and unredact personal information live in their environment. You start showing them the value, and it takes it from this is something I could build, and so why would we use a product, through to, well, I've just solved this really annoying problem that's been throwing requests in our logs or our analytics for months of all these spam services, spam visitors, and it's solved with just like 3 lines of code. And getting from that first step, because all developers think they can build something in a weekend, to actually showing them, well, you've achieved this with very little effort and time. And now you can actually go and do interesting things like build features for users.
Amazing. David, this has been an amazing conversation as you've walked us through how to bring these security practices closer to the developer experience and ultimately build those stronger and more secure tools and make that process something more harmonious between the developers and the security teams. I'm curious, where can folks go to follow you and learn more about what you're doing and working on, whether it's ArcJet or otherwise? Where can they find you?
So you can subscribe to Console.dev on the website, free every Thursday. And if you're interested in what we're doing at ArcJet, then it's arcjet.com.
Great. We'll make sure to put the information in the show notes so our listeners can check it out. And to wrap things up, that's it for today's show. We hope that you enjoyed our conversation today with David Mytton. And if you're enjoying these insights from engineering leaders, please make sure you head over to the Dev Interrupted Substack for weekly articles and deep dives on these kinds of episodes. And also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we can put all of our favorite moments from this episode and other ones as well. The last thing I'd like to say is we always love to hear from our audience. So please leave a comment, rate us directly within your favorite Spotify or within your favorite podcast app, and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.